Chapter 1. Northumbria, 1124. Someone was watching. She could feel it. Paige froze in the midst of donning her undergown. A twig snapped, muffled by the bracken of the forest floor, and she snatched down the hem, her eyes focusing upon the twisting shadows of the not-too-distant woods. She could see naught through the midnight blackness, and not more than silence reached her, a silence that settled like the night mist, formless and unnatural. Her teeth began to chatter, and for a long instant she stood there, chilled and wary, but she could hear nothing more than familiar night sounds, the croaking of frogs, the trilling of crickets, the distant howl of a wolf. A quiver passed down her spine, for she had heard something. She was nearly sure of it. 'Twould behoove her, she decided, to hie back to the safety of the keep, perhaps to rethink the wisdom in coming out alone at night. All these months of slipping out without incident had made her lax in her guard. Like 100 nights before, Paige had come out for her swim without bothering to inform anyone of her destination. Not that anyone would have cared, she assured herself quickly. God's truth, but the only blessed good to come of being daughter to a man who only wanted sons was that she had the freedom to do as she pleased. And yet it truly meant that nobody cared one whit where she went, what she did, or what became of her. And she didn't trouble herself to think tonight would be any different. On the other hand, she cared. She cared very much, and she had no intention of becoming somebody's or something's prey. She sat hurriedly upon the boulder beside where she'd lain her clothes and reached down to pluck up her beaten shoes from the dewy ground. She donned one quickly, muffling silent curses as her wet foot impeded her progress, and then changed her mind about lingering long enough to dress. Mist crept about her feet, nebulous fingers wrapping about her ankles, unsettling her. She didn't consider herself an overly fanciful person, but this instant she might as well have been a timid church mouse for all that her heart was racing. Peering up at the sliver of moon that hovered above, she surged to her feet, bending hurriedly to retrieve the remainder of her garments. Her eyes sought the metallic glimmer of her dagger beneath the pile of her clothing, and the downy hairs at her nape prickled when she failed to find it. For the love of Christ, where could she have put it? What good were clothing if she were dead? Dumping her gathered bundle, she lifted the other shoe to peer inside, thinking mayhap she'd placed the small dagger within it. But it wasn't there, and she stifled a curse, fearing God was like to banish her to purgatory for an eternity already for her irreverence. Damnation, but she couldn't help it. Where could it possibly be? Another twig snapped, closer this time, and Paige decided she didn't need the dagger after all. No sooner was her decision made when there was a hideous outcry. In the next instant they appeared, 3 barely discernible figures scrambling from the woods. She didn't linger to discover their intent. Shrieking in fear, Paige bolted, flinging the shoe behind her. An answering curse rang out, but she didn't bother turning to see what damage it may have inflicted. Minimal, if any, she was certain, for the soul was soft and worn with age. More's the pity. She would have hoped to pluck out an eye with it. Spouting oaths she didn't like to admit she knew, she ran with all her might towards the castle, crying out for aid, hoping Edwin the gatekeeper wasn't so inebriated that he thought her pleas a mere fancy of his cockeyed dreams. Blundering sot! If he had been at his post to begin with, she might not be in this predicament. She mightn't have left the castle so effortlessly. And yet she knew the fault was not his but hers. She should have known better. Curse her rotten luck. Her heart pounded faster with every stride she took. Like a death knell, the sound of their footfalls came faster, closer. She quickened her pace, surging forward with a burst of energy born of terror. Ignoring the pain that flared at her side, Paige kept near to the stream lest she collide with the enormous oak tree that guarded the pathway to the castle. God forgive her, but she hoped they wouldn't see it and break their bloody necks for their efforts. Her chest heaved. The pain in her side came sharper as she raced past the old oak. Still, they remained behind her, their footfalls catching her shorter strides with too little effort. She wasn't going to make it. She really wasn't going to make it. Paige wanted to weep with fear and despair. Ahead of her, Aldurg Castle loomed, a distant silhouette against the ebony sky. Distant and unreachable, like her father. Her heart hammered. She wasn't going to make it. Still she ran, nearly toppling headlong into the water when the path curved too sharply before her. Their voices chased her, indistinguishable and alien, like bats in the darkness of a cave, flying at her from all directions. Jesu, where were they now? Ahead of her? Behind her? Where? She wasn't going to make it. The stream wended its way before her, blanketed by a sheet of mist. A glimmer of hope sparked. Mayhap they couldn't swim. She didn't know many who could. Perchance she could lose them beneath the mist. A hand reached out, brushing her leg and nearly snatching her shift, followed by a profusion of indecipherable curses when her pursuer realized he'd missed. But the shock of his touch made Paige's decision for her. She couldn't afford to take the time to consider the consequences. Arms flailing, she hurled herself into the stream. Her legs followed like deadweight. She landed smack upon her belly, icy water striking her full in the face. The impact reverberated through her, numbing her senses, but Paige recovered her faculties quickly. Ignoring the sting of her flesh, she swam with all her might toward the opposite shore, all the while listening for sounds of pursuit behind her. Relief flowed through her when there were none. "Thank God! Thank you, God!" she prayed. Even after reaching the bank, there was still no evidence of her pursuers, only shouts and curses she couldn't quite decipher coming from somewhere on the opposite shore. But she didn't dare feel triumphant. If they were even vaguely familiar with the lay of the land, they would know that but a few furlongs ahead the stream ended and they would once again meet en route to the castle. Paige didn't intend to take that risk. Lifting herself from the water, sopping to her bones, she made instead for the sanctuary of the forest. They might expect her to run for the castle, as instinct was crying out she do. Logic told her she would fare much better doing the unexpected. If she made it into the safety of the woods and perchance climbed a tree, she could wait for them to tire of searching and then go home. They were likely no more than brigands, she their luckless prey. She was certain that given the choice of searching all night for some faceless woman to rut with, or seeking out more profitable victims, they would tire sooner rather than later and leave her be. Encouraged, she ran, panting, her heart pounding. Her wet undergown clung to her legs. Running, she tried not to trip as she peered behind to make certain they were not following, and once again relief surged through her, for there was no sign of her attackers. Euphoria washed over her. Sweet Jesu, she was going to make it after all. That, regrettably, was her last coherent thought before she turned and collided with a tree. At least, Paige thought it was a tree. The impact knocked her flat upon her back and left her reeling. She lay there, stupefied, staring up at a Goliath of a man. Jesu, but he was tall. Within the instant, she was surrounded by the rest of them. Their faces a blur in her benumbed state, they seemed to be leering down at her, disembodied teeth shining in the moonlight. "Ah, man, you've gone and made her daft," she understood one to say. She'll come about," assured another. "Scots! Bloody damned Scots!" She could tell by their brogue, but that was her last thought before darkness swallowed her.